And I'm recording it too. Do-do. So let's see, Scott, are you around? Is anybody here? Oh, actually, we should start broadcasting. We're broadcasting on YouTube, but we're not broadcasting anywhere else.
No.
So let's do that. How are you doing, Scott?
I'm doing...
Hold on. Let me click on the broadcast button and then I can ask you. Okay?
Yeah.
All right. And I have to rename myself. Look at me smashing TV. That's not cool. Okay, let's go. Okay, so clicking the broadcast button. And here we go. I think we are live. Maybe we are. Well, we never know, do we? How are you doing, Scott?
I'm doing quite well. How are you doing?
I'm doing quite well as well. It's been a busy day for me. What about you? Was it a busy day for you?
It's just getting started.
Oh, well, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, I hope it's not going to be too long.
So far, it's been pretty busy, though.
Okay. So. Do you think it's been a busy day for all the wonderful people joining us today?
Well, they can put that in the chat section right over here.
Yes, I would love to hear all the wonderful stories and horror stories from everything from client work to design work to anything, you know. Please raise your hand or actually type in something where you're from today so we know who is actually joining us today. And if you happen to watch us on YouTube as well, please do write a comment so we know that you exist, not just a phantom somewhere on the other side of the screen. Oh, wow, that's nice. So we'll have people from Russia, from Colorado, from Arnhem, Netherlands. And I see a couple of familiar people that I've been knowing for a while. Oh, of course, you had to plug in an emoji, Scott.
Where are you joining us from today? You're always on the move.
Well, I am, and it's actually very difficult for me to set up anything that would resemble some sort of I don't know, environment. So right now, this laptop is standing on top of 4 books of different size. One of them is a bit skewed. That's kind of just something that I see right now. And there is bottles of water and stuff around me.
Okay.
I'm from Budapest, kind of broadcasting from Budapest, Hungary, because why not?
Is it warm there?
No.
Okay.
It was heavily snowing yesterday, I guess, really heavily snowing. So, but I guess Roma is from Moscow. I guess it's snowing a bit more over there. What about Canada, Scott?
What do you think?
Probably sunshine and I guess like plus, I don't know, whatever. You can go bathing, no?
I think the high today is like -2. We're already at the high, so.
Okay. Well, I think that we should actually stop speaking about temperature because we have some more important things to talk about.
Yes. Well, you do.
Well, I do, yes. And I like being on time, and it's right 6 p.m. and I'm a bit concerned by the amount of free beer bottles in the back of your room.
So they're empty, but it's a comedian named Tom Green. You may have heard of him.
No, I haven't actually.
He was married to Drew Barrymore for a while, like a month.
Okay.
And we did a road trip on the weekend to go see him, and I got him to sign my bottles for me. So that's why I have.
That's nice. So we do not encourage the drinking of alcohol in this program.
Yes, I know.
Just
I'll turn the camera off.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, but I think we have some people joining us as well. We started a bit earlier than usual. Scott, because I can't see, myself when I'm speaking, if I lose, internet connection, anything, please let me know.
Yes,
right?
We'll do for sure.
Okay, perfect. And I think at this point, I'm ready to start. So first of all, welcome everyone. Sorry for the weird conversation between me and Scott. We're just buddies who know each other for years now. It's always wonderful to get people from all over the world joining us. And especially when it comes to topics that are kind of really, really difficult, I guess, to sell, if you know what I mean. Well, I've been speaking about privacy for this entire year, and it's been very interesting for me to explore what happened in this area, I guess. And I want to share some of the things with you today, right? And I would like to encourage you to drop in questions. So obviously you have a chat bubble thing at the bottom of Zoom, or if you're using YouTube, again, just type it in the comments, and I'll try to bring up all the questions and answer all the questions as well, right? And also, obviously, this session is being broadcasted on YouTube, and so it is also going to be available on smashmagazine.com. So if you go there, you will find it, the live stream there as well. Also for later if you want to read it at some point. Okay, Scott, if you don't mind, I'll taking over from this point.
See ya.
Yes, excellent. So let's see if we can share my desktop, and do let me know, Scott, if it's okay. So can you see this?
Yes, I can.
Okay, excellent. So, and I'm full screen, right?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So everyone, again, thank you so much for joining. I think we've been having very interesting conversations over the last couple of months, and actually a couple of years now, about a couple of things that are happening on the web. And I think among some of them, we kind of do not know what is happening, don't understand what is happening. We have to deal with those wonderful things like GDPR if you're in Europe, or CCPA if you're in California. But even if you're outside of these areas, you have noticed that something around privacy is happening at this point, right? But where is it coming from? And why all of a sudden we have this GDPR thing? And please do let me know if GDPR is affecting you in the webinar chat, so I'm not just me. But I asked myself, so where is it coming from, right? And by the way, if you happen to join us for the very first time, my name is Willy. And I'm a co-founder of Smasher Magazine, and I spend a lot of time in companies trying to understand what we can do better in terms of design, in terms of front end, in terms of UX, and anything of that kind. And this year has been the year of privacy for me. And so today I want to explore some of the interesting things that I've noticed about user behavior related to privacy, but also about design patterns that we can be using to enhance privacy and also improve the business KPIs as a result of that, right? And also kind of looking into the technical side of what it means for us as we're building web apps and websites as well, right? Now, yeah, this is me. This is how I used to look like back in the day. But it's very important to kind of see that some of the lessons that we were learning in the process of redesigning Smasher Magazine, kind of moving away from this design that you might have remembered from the old days, to this design, we're kind of also driven partly by the notion of privacy and respect, right? And I just wanted to show it because actually I'm going to bring it up every now and again. So let's take a look at this tracking and privacy and everything that's happening in the world today before we actually dive into what it means for us as designers or developers. And again, this is a session for both. So if you happen to be on the design side of things or development side of things, I think you'll have a couple of takeaways from this. Now, I asked myself actually early this year, how come that we ended up in this world where this is perfectly normal, right? It was very confusing to me to realize that the way that I saw the web, or how I saw the web, has changed massively over these years. Hold on, let me see. Can you also see my screen myself? Scott, can you also see my face, actually? I sincerely hope so. Okay, let's see. Yeah, I think we're good. Please let me know in the chat if you can see my face as well, because I will probably pause on the slides and yeah, all good, all right. And explain a couple of things. So I asked myself in the beginning of this year, how come is that we ended up in this world where we have all these pop-ups and push notifications and pop-ups and all of that kind of showing up, and we just take it, right? There is no resistance against us. We don't protest. We don't write enormous articles about this being a horrible state of the web. And I remember vividly the time when I started using the web was very different. I was very excited about the web. It was all crazy, and you would click on the button, you would never know what happens. But at least it wasn't, it was noisy, of course, but it wasn't that disrespectful in many ways. So I started looking around, and again, if you start looking, you'll find all kind of examples where things just wrong or weird or confusing, and maybe confusing by default, right? This is one of the examples for an online forum where they ask you a couple of questions, and one of them is, do you have children, right here in the middle? Do you have children? And then with a slider right next to it, which is a little bit weird, I would say, right? With a slider next to it, and also an input field, well, a kind of hidden input field. You have to tap on a pencil icon to change the value to input field. And that's such a weird way of doing this, right? And it's not just weird, it's more like disrespectful, because the slider has this property of minimum value and maximum value. and it has to be defined. So what gives the developers a reason to define the maximum being 5 at this point and the minimum being 0? Just really, really strange, right? And we see this kind of interface is kind of all over, right? So if you start going a little bit deeper, you'll find a couple of things like maybe, one of those, right? Anybody remembers Ryanair? Well, Ryanair was probably the first example of it, where whenever you book a flight with Ryanair, the insurance was added in for you automatically, unless you know how to opt out. And to opt out, you actually need to find it conveniently located between Denmark and Finland in the country selector, right? And at this point, we might think, oh, this is just horrible, this is weird, right? But the truth is that it's kind of a state of art. You'll find it everywhere, right? In the same way, like we find this kind of notifications everywhere. Like my Medic would like to send you notifications, and you have 2 really good options, right? No, you don't want to stay alive. Oh, yes, allow notifications. And I'm sure that there was an A/B test running, because at some point they introduced a new version, which allows you to choose between, no, I prefer to bleed to death, right? Or allow notifications. Again, very, very confusing in many ways, and just unfair, I would say. Well, more often than that, we see that this kind of notion of disrespect, and I would like to focus on that at this point, is a little bit more, I would say a little bit more subtle, or even invisible sometimes, where you find, this even things like, Facebook, where you go and you explore the interface on the navigation, and then you end up with a little red bubble next to watch, although you actually never went to watch. So how come we end up seeing this, right? And of course, all of these beauties, obviously, right, where we have all these examples of somebody just bought this or somebody just bought that, right? And all those things are kind of prevailing. And in fact, if we look deeper into it, we'll find out that many times there will be a script running that kind of combines the product names, the product images, and random names of people to create a solution that there is actually somebody buying at this very moment, which is not necessarily true at all. Now, for this year, I decided to kind of really to get to the bottom of this. How did we end up here, and how can we actually make it a bit better as a community? And I decided to do 2 things, which is why my year was a little bit weird, to say. The first thing was, well, what if every time somebody sends me a link to a service or a tool or anything of that kind, I'm going to go to extremes to read the privacy policy in its entirety, right? Have you ever done that before? Do you read privacy policies for fun? Please do write in the chat if you do. I don't think you do. And I think I was amazed by how difficult and how time-consuming it is. And don't get me wrong, I want, one of those people who is just trying to make my life difficult. I just try to understand where we are first, right? And that was a really tough year. And one of the longest privacy policies I've ever read was the one from Amazon, which took me like 8 hours, 40 minutes or so, and a couple of coffees in between. And it's not even that they're long. It's really hard to understand them. It's really, really hard to understand what is actually going on and all the different terminology and all of that. And the weirdest thing is, it became kind of a normal thing that every time we sign up for a new service, we just accept it without even thinking about it, right? This is fundamentally flawed in many ways. How did we end up in this world again where privacy policies are getting longer and longer, more convoluted and more convoluted over time, and more difficult to understand, right? So even 8 hours, after 8 hours, 40 minutes, I wasn't sure that I actually understood what is being said there, right? And it goes to everything, right? So the second thing I decided to do as well for this year is that every time I encounter this cookie pop-up at the bottom, I will go to extremes to opt out from every single tracker, just to see how much time it takes to opt out from every single tracker, right? And guess what? Do you have any estimates of how much time it would usually take? Right? You've probably seen these wonderful cookie pop-ups all over, right? Well, for me, it took on average, because there were some really weird outliers, it would say approximately 42 seconds, 44, 44 seconds, right? Because it makes, many of those decisions or designs, I don't even know if they can call them design properly, because they don't really solve a problem, they introduce a problem, really. They make it really, really hard to opt out. And it's not because I'm one of those people who is installing all kind of Tor clients and goes into darknet just to not be tracked. No, I just wanted to understand what it means, what it all means. And even those little things, you go on Google and you want to install anything from Google, anything like, let's say, WhatsApp, right? There's 2 options, right? You can click on the agree button and that's it. Or at the bottom, you can read more about the key updates, and only then you can unlock or uncheck that option to share the details with Facebook, right? You'll find it all over. There are also some really strange things, like, for example, F-Secure's Herald clause. This has been kind of making rounds on the web as well for a while. Whenever you set up a Wi-Fi hotspot, a public Wi-Fi hotspot, you, of course, provide consent for the privacy policy and all of that. And then in that privacy policy, it says, or terms and conditions, it says that as you're using the service, you also agree to assign your firstborn child to them for the duration of eternity. And they can pull that off, and they can even have fun of that, just because nobody really reads those privacy policies, right? And this is a really dangerous part to go, right? Now, why did it take me so long to read the Amazon's privacy policy? Well, because it's really, really long, right? If you go and actually start exploring it, eventually at some point, I think it's 57.10 or so, you'll find out a very interesting clause, which is also called the zombie apocalypse clause, right? Because one of the products that they're building is called Lumberjack, I think, engine, which is a game engine for developers to build virtual zombies and things like that. And so essentially they have this little clause, and I think that they meant it maybe as fun, but maybe not. But in case in case you have an epidemic going on and there is a fall of organized civilization, right, when humans' corpses reanimate and seek to consume living human flesh, blood, brain, or nerve tissue, they will not be reliable, although they created this product. So once you start kind of looking at the privacy policies, you find out kind of a lot of really strange things happening there. Now, anybody used FaceApp? So please write yes if you do, or no if you didn't. So FaceApp was kind of making rounds for a while. And essentially, it's an app where you can upload your photo, and then it shows you how you will look like older, right? It's been really kind of viral around the web and very, very popular, maybe a little bit too popular, if you ask me. You could see it on Facebook and on everywhere all the time. And somebody sent me a link to it, and of course I had to read the privacy policy before I actually get into it. And I was shocked. What really shocks me is the fact that all these things that show up using artificial intelligence and machine learning and all of that, right? They show up and they have a pretty okay interface. I wouldn't say it's remarkable, but it's kind of okay, and they're free to use, right? But how come that they all have an extremely lengthy privacy policy that gets all the details from you, like full stop, every single thing? Not only whenever you sign up to using the service, which is just gives you an opportunity to upload a photo and see yourself older, right? You grant FaceApp irrevocable, non-exclusive, royalty-free, worldwide, fully paid, transferable, sub-licensable license to use, reproduce, modify, adapt, publish, translate, create derivative works from, distribute, and so on and so forth. Give them full rights to everything that depicted in your photo. And the worst thing about it is not even that, because if you look on Instagram and Facebook and all of them, and again, don't get me wrong, I'm using them as well. I'm just trying to understand what is the world in which we're living, right? Essentially, what really confuses me is that they can use your photo in any way they like, in any channel they want, for any product they will be developing in their lifetime without compensation to you, right? And this is just clearly written in that thing. And in fact, you can even go further, because they can also place a device identifier and may deliver information to them or third-party partner about how you browse and use the service. Essentially, they can also give it away. So other companies, mostly third parties, can track you and kind of send you personalized content and advertising, right? And I don't mean anything against advertising, but this is just getting to extremes. And then you find also these wonderful services which were really helpful for me. One of them is terms of service didn't read, right? Which essentially highlights all the different things you might want to know, especially in light of CCPA and in light of GDPR and all the privacy regulation coming. Because if you're using one of those tools, you really might want to know what happens to your customers' data, right? Because it's also your responsibility whenever somebody requests the deletion of your data to actually delete that data or forward that request over to all the third parties that you're using. So this is a really nice service which kind of highlights what is happening, and not even in terms of like privacy policy, but even like terms and conditions. So what about refunds? What about violation of service? What is going to happen to you? Copyright claim and other things. So terms of service didn't read really helped me many times this year, right? And then, of course, whenever you end up with this, things are getting just weird. For a while, YouTube was serving ads with CPU draining cryptocurrency miners, where you, as watching, whenever you're watching a video on YouTube, you would be also crypto mining for somebody else, which is not quite what you want. And so we started fighting back. This is where the old story begins, right? We started fighting back with things like ad blockers and tracking blockers. And in fact, if you look back, things that are happening right now are kind of really kind of symbolic for the change that I think is happening this year and will be happening in a more higher level, actually, on a more higher dimension next year, where you have Firefox actively blocking third-party tracking cookies and crypto mining by default, right? We also see things like this happening in Chrome, where you can block third-party cookies when you set it up, but it's not blocked by default, right? You also see Safari with intelligent tracking prevention, and you also see Edge introducing tracking prevention since June this year, right? So it's not just a few people realizing that's a little bit too much of what's happening around the world here. It's also browsers actually actively introducing measures to prevent tracking, right? And that's kind of really important, because if you look into the understanding of how people perceive the web, right, it has changed as well. Now, for a long time, I thought that ad block or any kind of ad blocker, just me. So me, maybe a couple of my friends using an ad blocker, or content blockers and Facebook blockers and all those things. Are you using an ad blocker? If you could say yes in the chat, that would be very helpful for me. And if no, please say no. When I was studying how people behave on the web today, and when I was kind of looking and interviewing young generation, the people between 14 and 25, I was so shocked, because again, for a long time I thought that it's just me using a net blocker, but it seems like a net blocker has become a mainstream, and it's really hard to find anybody between 16 and 25 who has never heard of a net blocker or doesn't use a net blocker. It's kind of really becoming a standard at this point, which is a big problem for publishers, of course, right? But it's also kind of for many people, it's more like a prevention mechanisms to access faster web, because they don't even like the web that much. But I remember the times when AdBlock Plus was in court, where a couple of companies lobbied against AdBlock Plus, trying to make it illegal, and they actually lost because the court ruling blocked ad blockers against media firms, backed ad blockers against media firms, right? And then I remember that these things started showing up. You might have seen it. Block ad block, which is one of the scripts that allows you to stop ad blocking on your site. But then I remember, when these things showed up, almost a day later, just a day later, there was an anti-ad block killer, which is essentially an ad blocker or something of that kind, right? And there is this entire war going on where every single day, you see tools showing up which really try to protect customers in some way, and also, of course, maybe monetize it in some way as well. And I see all these things like Ghostery, for example. Anybody using Ghostery, maybe? Well, for a long time, Ghostery was a little bit difficult. It's not quite clear what's happening now. They changed hands, I believe, right? But if you look into Ghostery, the problem with Ghostery was that they were also collecting the data about the advertising that was being blocked, and then they would actually sell it to advertising industry so they know what is being blocked, right? But it was 2013. Things might have changed, of course, but this is such a weird place to be. Like, if you look into this entire tracking in more detail, the more you're deep, the further you're deep, the stranger it gets, right? And so we also have these things kind of really making a breakthrough. Facebook Container to block Facebook from tracking. The new coming of this year is Stop Chat Pop-ups, which allows you to block chat pop-ups at the bottom. There's also I don't care about cookies, which essentially just accepts everything, which is kind of troublesome, if you ask me. And then there's this thing that came up, like this, which is kind of really cool. It's kind of a new kind of incognito, where you can select a profile that you would like to adopt, and then it kind of targets specifically Facebook and Instagram and others, and it opens 100 pages or sites that essentially contains all these important trackers and tries to manipulate or change your personality, your profile, totally screwing up the way Instagram and Facebook, and essentially the same thing, what they know about you. Just incredible, right? This kind of things showing up, becoming kind of a mainstream as well. Now, when I looked and started exploring the state of the web, this is what I ended up with, right? This is how people perceive the web today. Whenever they encounter pop-up and models, they're going to be blocked either by an ad blocker or manually. Push notifications, whenever they showed up, they're blocked or ignored right away. Chat window pop-ups mostly blocked unless you're looking for something specific or need help, maybe when you're making a purchase or so. Feedback pop-ups like, please complete a survey to help us, always blocked or ignored. Install app prompts, mostly ignored, right? Unless you're using the website quite a lot. Important context, usually blocked because many people still remember the LinkedIn fiasco, where LinkedIn had told quite a bit of money just because they were spamming people on users regard, right? You would import context and all the context all of a sudden will get notification about that wonderful service. Nobody wants to have this experience. Geolocation permission, usually blocked unless you explain specifically why you need this information. GDPR or this cookie pop-up thing, whatever, mostly okay. We have nothing to lose, so we have nothing to be afraid of at this point. Whenever somebody asks you to turn off a net blocker, there are two established strategies that people have adopted. One of them is going to private window incognito mode, and the other is using a different kind of browser for specific things, right? So making somebody turning off a net blocker for a particular site really requires a lot of effort or a lot of loyalty from the customer side. It's really, really hard to get it, right? Access to camera photos usually blocked, microphone blocked, unless you want to stream videos or things like that, right? Video autoplay while people scroll past through it very quickly if there is a video autoplay. Email input, that's an interesting one. Let me ask you one thing. Imagine you're at an airport, right? And you want to get into Wi-Fi and you have 4 options to sign in with, right? You have the option to sign in with Twitter, you can sign in with Facebook, you can sign in with Instagram, or you can sign in with an email, right? Now, please raise your hand if you would sign in with Twitter. I think there is an option to sign in, to raise hand at some point. Nobody? Oh, maybe. Oh, actually, 2 people. 2 people. Who would sign in with Facebook? Please raise your hand as well. Also 2 people. Not that much. Who would sign in with Instagram? Usually we don't sign in with Instagram. It's our darling, right? Well, I guess that most of you will sign in with email. Please raise your hand if you do. Yes, vast majority, actually. Well, what kind of email would it be, though? There are 3 types of emails. The very, very important primary email, a very personal email account. That's something that you usually do not share, maybe only with friends, right? Then there is a throwaway email. It's a temporary email, fake email, anything of that kind that you might be using quite a lot. In my case, it's marcus@gmail.com. Yeah, poor Marcus, I guess. So this is the one email filled in with accounts and newsletters you don't need or not read, and temporary stuff that you're just creating for the sake of it sometimes whenever you need it, right? And then there is a middle one, the 3rd email, which is kind of, there may be some newsletters every now and again. That's kind of it's kind of the one that people will check every now and again, but not all the time. So getting to that first very private email is very, very hard. It's almost impossible for us as people who are providing a service for somebody, right? Most of the time we'll be ending up in the 3rd, but luckily, well, hopefully we can also end up in the 2nd. And this is the best we can do. So getting a proper email address from somebody is really, really hard because people have learned to provide fake addresses. And not only fake addresses, the same goes for gender, age, phone input. Very often people would, whenever they have to type in a phone number and they don't understand why that phone number is needed, they will try to avoid giving the honest or the authentic phone number. So instead, they would write their phone number because this is the formatting that's usually checked. And then they would check the last 2 or 3 symbols, digits, so that people cannot, or the companies cannot spam them. Please raise your hand if you do that as well. Oh, wow, the big number of people, a lot of people. Now, what can we do with capture? Well, we can just cry. Although there's not really capture at this point anymore. At this point, we have this crosswalks and whatever cars that we have to decipher, which takes a lot of time. But this is kind of what people really hate when they encounter this. This is why people hate the web. And if you look into all of this entire picture, it's really bleak, right? There is no excitement. There is no happiness. There are no happy moments. It looks pretty bad, actually, pretty red. Right? And still there is this notion sometimes, and this is kind of my pathway, gate to privacy. Many people that I was interviewing, mostly students from Germany, from Netherlands, mostly Europe, Ukraine, Georgia, and other places, they would often tell me things like, well, I have nothing to hide. So what if Instagram and Facebook, kind of know everything about me, maybe a little bit too much about me? So what? What's a big deal? Why is everybody so complaining and making everybody so paranoid? Please raise your hand if you think so as well. And don't worry, it's a safe place. I'm not going to be, judging here, maybe a little. Right? Well, some of us are kind of in this area, and I think this is a very dangerous thing to think, because we never know where our data might end up. This year has been a really strange and horrible year for a couple of reasons. One of them was because it kind of was the year when the menstrual surveillance has become a thing, where many pregnancy apps, applications that allow you to track your pregnancy, would collect data and identify some patterns and sell certain patterns or sell certain ideas to highest bidders, kind of trying to help managers identify if a kind of specific person working in the company might be expecting a baby or not, right? Hopefully it's anonymized, but actually, even if it's anonymized, it's just horrible, right? So essentially, all these apps where you might be paying for them, you might not be paying for them, they're collecting data because there is not anything more valuable than your data. It's a really, really precious asset. Have you asked yourself, how come that Facebook and Instagram and all the others don't have a premium account where you could sign up for, I don't know, $4 or $5 a month, right? And you would not be tracked and you would not get any advertising or anything of that kind. Well, they don't have it because your data is much more valuable than that. Much, much more valuable than that. Which is why all these apps show up, where essentially the reason why they're all free is because they provide these horrendous privacy policies to collect the data, right? And not even that. I mean, you find it in every single industry going, every single kind of knowledge domain. You look into health insurance, your health insurer will definitely want to know how often you go to the gym, what you eat, when you eat, and other things, kind of creating some sort of patterns. So based on your expectations, your age, and other things, and what you're doing, they could maybe adjust the interest rates based on that. That's not their business. So it's not really about having something to hide, right? It's about protecting something that belongs to you and is nobody else's business. And I think this is very important. So whenever you have a conversation with your colleagues, we have to be aware of us, first of all, not knowing what happens to the data. Second of all, us not having any control about what will happen to the data, because we just check off the privacy policy and call it a day. The same goes for terms and conditions as well, right? And third of all, we have very different understanding of privacy altogether. So whenever you look into the US and let's say Germany, you'll kind of have two very different concepts of privacy fighting against each other. It's very normal in, let's say, US or Canada, that whenever you sign up for the service, that the service owns the data. That's just very normal, right? Historically, this has been like that, right? In Germany, this is not normal. In Germany, the service has to ask for the data. And this is kind of where the origins of GDPR make sense, right? Because if you are not asked and the data is being collected, then that is just not right. This is not a kind of a proper interpretation of how we perceive privacy that is here in Europe, right? And so this kind of gives us a little bit of an insight of where it's all coming from, right? And then you also see these things showing up, which is just remarkable. Somebody has bought a list of pregnant ladies from a data broker, right? And then send out postcards congratulating to the families with packages disguised as personal notes. Quite horrible, if you ask me as well, right? Because this data is kind of being collected whenever you want it or not. Now, anybody had this feeling in the past? Maybe you're talking to a friend about anything, and all of a sudden, that thing that you spoke about shows up on Instagram and in WhatsApp and maybe in Google Ads as well. Anybody, please raise your hands if you did. Well, a couple of people, right? And this is actually is happening because every single day, right, there are approximately 100, according to this article, there are hundreds, and it was 2018, there are hundreds of audio segments that are being sent to Facebook servers and Google servers, and it's not quite clear what they contain and why they're being sent, right? But again, there are probably some triggers that trigger you sending that notification or that audio segment to a particular server, right? And I think it's just really, really critical, because actually when you start looking into it in a more larger scale, all these things that show up, like Axiom as being one of them, they have so much data about us. They know us much better than we do. And because there is an approximation that they have approximately 10,000 data points about every single person that is using a platform, right? Knowing us much better than we do, and our parents and our friends and everybody else combined. And there was even these things showing up. And this is just to really set the context of what we're going to speak about next, right? There is this thing where on a particular site, I'm not going to mention it, you can actually select the campaign that best fits your needs in terms of sending a message to somebody who would be a target. So you pick that person, you give them their email address or their Instagram account, anything of that kind. And then you can target the message and send them a message like get back to your ex or propose marriage or things like that. And they're going to be bombarded on social networks, mostly Instagram, with 180 impressions of articles and advertising, pseudo-advertising. It's kind of trying to send them a subliminal message that they actually should be getting back with somebody or propose marriage. And what's really weird about this is not even that it exists. The weirdest thing is that it's perfectly legal. There is no legal framework that would say this is immoral or horrible, should be forbidden. No, and it costs just $49, right? Just remarkable that this thing kind of exists without us having to say anything about it. Now, where does GDPR fit into this? Well, and most of you, oh, I think that I must have blocked the slide, I'm sorry. So where does GDPR fit into this? If I asked you about GDPR, I'm pretty certain that most of you will not be very excited about it. And the reason for it is because it's a legal obligation that we as designers or developers have in order to do certain things in our interface to protect the privacy of our customers. And in fact, GDPR is all about giving control to customers so they know what is going to happen to the data, right? So I want to kind of briefly look into it and then try to explain what it actually means for us in terms of patterns that we could be adopting to improve privacy of our users. Now, GDPR came into force almost, I think, 25th of May 2018, right? And it's not coming out of nowhere. There was a Directive 95/46/EC of the European Parliament from 1995, which just kind of defines the way of how data is protected and what actually data means, right? So it's kind of a regulation about the protection of individuals with regard to the processing of personal data, right? And that means that because it's kind of a regulation, a directive, it kind of defines what is going to happen to the data, what data is, and how interfaces, or us essentially, developers or designers, have to respect it as we're moving forward. Now, obviously, the web has changed between 1995 and now. GDPR is kind of an evolution, so to say, of that directive, which kind of brings up new laws and new regulations into play, right? Now, GDPR per se is also a very interesting reading material for Friday night, right? But it defines a couple of things and defines them in a very kind of customer-friendly way. Now, first of all, when it comes to data, it's not just cookies. Very often we think that GDPR is just about the cookies. It's not, right? GDPR, as proclaimed by Dr. Ann Kawikian in 1990, actually, is all about all kind of data: generic data, biometric data, location data, online identifiers, be it IP addresses, mobile device IDs, browser fingerprints, RFID tags, MAC addresses, and everything else, including also cookies and telemetry, right? Anything that can identify a natural person is data, right? Now, GDPR has a very simple foundation at its core, and that's privacy by design, which means very similar to what in Europe is perceived as privacy for like many years, or how privacy is treated in Europe for many years, but very uncommon to how US, for example, or Canada see privacy. So privacy by design means that by default, privacy is given. So if you need to use a customer's data, you cannot collect it without customer's consent. And you always need to ask for consent first. And the privacy effort is not something that's kind of added in later, right? It's something that exists from the very start. It's a default setting embedded into the design, embedded into the development as well. And it's also visible and transparent, meaning that you can adjust your settings as a customer. So you can be forgotten, which is something we'll get into later. And you have to really have control and clarity about how your data is collected and where it's collected and how long it's collected, right? And it also means, of course, that because privacy kind of goes hand in hand with security. So whenever you're choosing a particular way of storing data, it's also your responsibility to make sure that you're saving the data securely. Now, there are a couple of things that are going on there. Just a few things that are important to understand is privacy and security are default, right? Whenever we're choosing some sort of APIs or third parties, it's our responsibility to ensure that they are safe, right? Whenever you need only core functionality to, whenever you kind of request only core information, kind of something really little from the customers, mostly, functional cookies, let's say, then you don't even need consent. This should not be asked, right? But no unnecessary data may be collected by default as well. So unnecessary data may be collected, if you put it differently, only with users' consent, right? But that consent can always be revoked or edited or adjusted or changed. And also customers can download and delete the data, and they have the right to be forgotten irrevocably, so you cannot come back to them at any point later in the future. And if you look into all of this, of course, if you look into GDPR and you start reading it, it will be a bit more verbose, and there will be many more other cases mentioned there. But it's kind of common sense safeguards for data protection and for privacy, right? Does it make sense so far? Please raise your hand if it does. Just want to make sure that it's perfectly clear. Okay, so we're good here, right? So all those things are kind of really just reasonable principles, right? Now let's take a look at what happened with it. So it was 2018 when it all got introduced. Now there was a study that on cookie banners that found out that in August 2018, less than 5% of the 5,000 most popular websites provided a visible choice to decline extensive data sharing, meaning they're not GDPR compliant. And again, remember, if you look back, transparency and clarity, right? So you should be able to have a choice to accept cookies or not accept cookies. And most of the time, you don't get that, right? And what do we do instead? Well, instead we see these things, right? We see things like review your cookie policy whenever you go to any website in the world. Every time somebody from the US comes to Europe, they're surprised and confused by this sheer amount of cookie pop-ups all over, right? But most of the time, they're not even GDPR compliant, and they're not really helpful either, which is something we'll get into later. So you find all those things where you can review your cookie policy, but then as you look at the bottom, by clicking I accept or X right here on the banner, or using our site, you consent to the use of cookies unless you have disabled them. Now that's not GDPR compliant because there is no choice, right? You can it's essentially like saying you either accept everything like we do with privacy policy most of the time, or you walk away, right? Now this is not the choice. Again, this is not GDPR compliant. Now you might say, so what's the big deal? The New York Times is somewhere, this is by the way New York Times. New York Times is somewhere in the US, and we're somewhere in Europe. So, it's not like I can go against New York Times. Who's going to protect me? Now, there is a data protection officer in every company that essentially is responsible for the treatment of data by EU citizens, sorry. And so you can file a complaint, right? And essentially what will happen is either, of course, you cannot go to court against New York Times. But as far as I understood it, well, you can actually go to your representative in your country and essentially inform them that this particular website or this particular service does not respect your rights. And then that will be kind of propagated. And then eventually New York Times might be blocked in your country because it's not respecting the customer's laws or the customer's rights, right? There is no proper legislation around you going to court against New York Times because they don't respect your rights. It's actually much more, how would I put this, layered, right? So this makes it a bit more difficult, right? So this is why you don't see those things like AirHelp, right? Where you can just sign in, add a flight number, and then get a refund because somebody violated your rights. This is not how it works, right? Now, at the same time, we also see these beauties showing up, right? Which are kind of lengthy, right? So every time you have to opt out from something, it's going to be quite difficult. Now, this is what we get to see in Europe quite a lot, right? So you have to spend a lot of time going to try to figure out if somebody is collecting the data or not. And the sheer amount of data is just remarkable, right? It really is. And then the weirdest part about this particular page at H, right, is whenever you're saving your settings, there's a processing in place which takes approximately 2 minutes or so, right? Which is essentially just trying to get information from you, whatever it costs. And this is all over, right? All these things are kind of showing up quite a lot, right? Which is, again, not what GDPR was supposed to be, right? You're supposed to have a very clear choice. You either accept or you reject. And so this is not quite what actually happened in the end. And what happened in the end was things like this, right? Where you would get something like Windows saying, unfortunately, the website is currently unavailable in most European countries, because of GDPR. And sometimes you get actually to a better experience. On Washington Post, you have to pay a premium EU subscription to get access to data because you don't want to be tracked. And the USA Today decided to run a separate version of their website for European customers, European Union users, which is essentially 5 or 6 times smaller in size and doesn't have any advertising, right? So the result or the impact or the output of what we saw is weird. And also these things kind of started showing up, where you have cookie settings, and as GDPR requires, the necessary cookies are enabled by default, and that's perfectly fine for the functionality of the site. Statistics, comfort, and personalization are not. But then you have this big red button at the bottom saying select all and confirm, which essentially selects all and confirms, or confirm selection, which is much subdued and much more subtle. Or this one, which is kind of the same thing, where you have necessary opted in by default, which is a requirement, and then analytical targeted advertising are not, but then you have only 2 options: to allow all cookies or manage cookie settings, where you go into details on a separate screen, which is again a little bit weird, right? Allow all cookies definitely not GDPR compliant at this point, because you're trying to trick somebody into getting into consent. Now, what does it mean for us? Can we do better? Well, of course we can, but I think that marketing department, potentially, or advertising industry will not be very happy about it. You need to have a clear choice. So if you go to iamsterdam.com, you have 2 options: adjust cookie settings or approve, right? And then once you click on adjust cookie settings, well, essentially it has functional cookies accepted by default, as it should be. And then these cookies are not, and static advertisement are not either. And then you have options: use default settings, which are these ones, or approve, right? Sometimes you can even have some fun. On ReSharper, they have this little pop-up at the bottom where you can type in a basher-like interface, yes, I agree, or no, I don't agree, right? Now, a very common pattern that's becoming more popular these days is this one, right? Whenever you're showing a push notification, right, it's really important to show it at the point when you're going to get a yes. Very often, let me just pause for a second here. Very often we get this push notification on Lord whenever we just enter the page, and that never works, because you don't want to kind of get into a relationship with the site before you even know it, right? So I think in many ways, when we start thinking about those things like a push notification, we should be really smart about it, because if somebody clicks it away or clicks on no, there is no way, literally absolutely no way, to get them back, right? So we need to show that push notification only at the point when we're absolutely certain that we're going to get a yes. And the same goes for other things, like cookie settings or any kind of geolocation or anything. We need to show it only when we know for sure that somebody's going to get to say yes. So Scott, just in case you're wondering, I will need just 10 more minutes, and then I'm good, because I see you raising hands all the time. So one good way out is to say, well, let's just explain the different levels. So here, if you go on Envision app, you have 3 options: required cookies, functional cookies, and advertising cookies. And they actually show or explain what each of them means with a slider, as you saw in the very beginning, right? So they're very kind of specific about what is allowed, what's not allowed, and what is required, what's not required. And in fact, you can even get people to submit to advertising cookies if they know that they're used for good reasons. There is nothing wrong with advertising. The only problem is actually more like tracking. If you're promising somebody to not, give the data away to third parties or fourth parties, right? Then you might be even getting those kind of the advertising cookies set up as well, right? So that's just something that we need to look into as well, right? The obvious one is, of course, I accept or I do not accept cookies, right? Like on SourceForge, you have 2 options, right? And once you click on one of them, I do not accept, you can choose what you want to accept or not. And there are 2 clear options as well: accept all or reject all, and that's it, right? Which is, again, very much GDPR compliant. But we don't see it happening much, right? We see most of the time really tricky things that try to trick us into the consent. Now, luckily, on October 1st, 2019, which was like 2 months ago, right, the highest legal entity of the European Union, the Court of Justice of the European Union, ruled in the case of Planet 49, which is more like a case in the case in Europe, that the only form of valid consent for processing user data in the European Union is explicit consent. For example, consent that is actively and specifically given by the website users by ticking a box, right? So, which means that there is no such thing as silent consent, right? There is just no such thing. You cannot enforce people to accept into privacy, giving away all privacy just to use the site. So there needs to be a very clear and very clear intent to share that particular data. That's a very recent case that actually made quite some news, especially in Germany, actually, right? Now, if we look into the data, what we'll find out is that over the last few years, the last year, there have been 95,000 complaints about GDPR violations. And it seems like, well, when we see AirHelp trying to enforce EC 261 regulation if your flight gets delayed, right? We don't have that in GDPR, and it's probably not going to come. But we still see these cases where a Polish retailer gets 645,000 fine on GDPR, essentially just by not using enough protection to save users' data. That happened for retail company in Poland, right? And we see similar cases in school where there's use photos of children for facial recognition without asking for permission. And in France for insurance, where an online check revealed that the accounts of the company's customers were accessible via hypertext links referenced in the search engine. And just more like us not being careful, and as a result, there is quite significant fine that's associated with it. Now, let's just go through a couple of cases and how we can make things a bit better. But before we do that, just one thing I want to show quickly is that there is this very common document which came up from European Parliament 2017. It was a couple of years ago, well, actually, right? Which essentially highlights that the consent rule to protect the confidentiality of terminal equipment failed to reach its objective as end users face requests to accept tracking cookies without understanding their meaning, right? A long time ago already, European Parliament kind of understood that the way we're asking for permission to get somebody else's data is not quite working well. So there is this proposal for quite some time, where the idea was, and this is seemingly where the European Parliament is heading at this point, but the idea is, instead of these cookie pop-ups that we see all over, we should be expecting potentially in the near future, maybe in a couple of years, we should be expecting browser settings to implement the do not track setting, which already exists anyway, right? So as you update your browser, as a customer, you'll have to choose, what options are okay with you, advertising, personalization, and other things. And only if you select something like personalization and other things, right? Only then the user, the website or the app may collect that data. But there will be no, it's kind of a different mechanism of collecting the data. There is no active mechanism anymore, right? It's not like you have to go to every single website and decide there, right? Instead, you define it on the browser level, and then this header, the do not track header, might potentially be advertised to websites or web applications. So it's going to be our responsibility as designers and developers to respect that. And even further than that, it's going to be our responsibility as designers to figure out what should be the experience if somebody decides not to be tracked. So there is no personalization, basically, potentially, or somebody decides to be tracked. So there is quite some stuff happening. And in fact, there is an e-privacy regulation coming up, which has this part embedded in that regulation. Now, GDPR was one of the two major changes that are coming up last couple of years. And I'm going to just read it out loudly here, because I think it's very important. The cookie provision, which has resulted in an overload of consent requests for internet users, will be streamlined. The new rule will be more user-friendly, as browser settings will provide for an easy way to accept or refuse tracking cookies and other identifiers. The proposal also clarifies that no consent is needed, and that's important, for non-privacy intrusive cookies, improving internet experience, like to remember shopping cart history. That's probably something we know as a functional cookies, right? Or core functionality cookies. Or cookies used by a website to count the number of visitors. So that's much more reasonable, where essentially analytics and core functionality will be allowed by default. You don't even have to display anything, right? But whenever you need something else, more than that, well, then you have to ask for permission, right? Which is, again, a little bit more respectful. So we don't know if do not track is going to be back or not. Probably not, to be honest, but there will be a similar mechanism to make that happen. Now, let's take a look at just quickly at some patterns, and you'll find much more stuff in the slide deck as well. But I just want to highlight a few which are kind of really symbolic for the changes that we need to do in our interfaces to be respectful of privacy, right? One important thing is that we always have to figure out the healthy business metrics mix. I mean, I'm working with many companies, and in companies, it's very common to track just a couple of very important metrics. Most of the time, it will be conversion, right? However, conversion is just one part of the story. Of course, we need to increase conversion, but it cannot be at the cost of just showing a pop-up or trying to gather all the data, because we have to kind of get a more holistic picture of where we are, right? We have to look into the time to repeat purchase. How often do people come back? What is about retention, right? Maybe next time somebody goes to the website for the first time, we have to be progressive about the privacy, right? So maybe they just enter the site, we accept only core functionality cookies, and we just, because we're allowed to use analytics, right? We can collect some data about where the people go, how much time they spend, and so on. And then if somebody's visiting a page quite frequently, maybe after a couple of visits, maybe 5 visits later or so, we could start showing up. Maybe we could get access to, marketing cookies, so we could get some more information about you and your preferences. Or we can also personalize the site, right, experience. And then as you keep going and the site, somebody keeps using the site, we're kind of building trust, which has been lost for many years now because of all the examples that I showed in the beginning, right? So we're kind of moving from this wall of text where I either accept or walk away towards something a bit more granular, where you ask for exactly what you need, right, at this point, and you always ask when you know for sure that you're going to get a yes, or when you're likely to get a yes. It's kind of moving towards a progressive privacy policy, right? And then you have other metrics like time to first share, time to first purchase, time to first upgrade, customer performance metrics, and of course the lifetime value. At the same time, we also need to understand that every time we're showing up a pop-up, let's say, and we increase conversion, it might not necessarily be helpful, because you might have a massive increase in return costs, in sales and marketing costs as a result, customer support inquiries, confusing encounters, right, negative encounters, right? So all those things kind of have to be measured together so we create a balanced experience. And one of the important things that companies have started introducing is how often do people actually mark an email as spam whenever they're getting a subscription email, right? And also a turnaround score. How often does it happen, or how much time it takes for somebody who is frustrated with the service to become a loyal customer again? So all those things kind of have to be measured, and only they together create kind of a reasonable mix of metrics to track, right? That's kind of a very important first step. Another important thing is that whenever we're asking for data, we have to explain why somebody needs this data, right? So, or why we as developers or why we as website owners need the data. And that's really easy to do. You need to provide just-in-time explanations. So every time you ask for a phone number, if you want to get the right or correct phone number, you have to explain why you need it with a little tooltip on the side, right? Every time you are going into things like privacy policy here, right? Instead of showing a wall, maybe you could show a summary, right? For every single section, kind of translating that weird wall of text into something that customers can understand, right? So you can use some concise hints and explain why and what data is collected and for how long, and then optimize for kind of fast skimming, just to make sure that somebody who is aware of it can actually understand what is going on, right? This is why some companies ended up creating some sort of a central hub, privacy hub. Like I'm seeing here, you can get all the information really beautifully presented, and you can adjust your settings and adjust the link that lives at the bottom in the footer, right? But you can always change and look into how much data has been collected, how long it's been collected, instead of just having a little script running that essentially just collects all the cookies and that's it, right? So let's see. I'm sorry if my connection isn't that great, Jake. But I will send you the slides, of course, and they're already available, I believe, so you can take a look in more detail. Another thing that's also important is whenever you ask for gender, must be an option of rather not say, right? And you have to be more explicit instead of saying just she and he. And so you always need to provide a way out, because many people don't want to share this data. They don't want to share the birth date, phone number, right? Also gender, also title. So I'd rather not say is a good option to keep in mind. And even things like off-boarding, like we see here on Financial Times, for example, right? Where you have a very straightforward process. And also at the same time, it's kind of respectful, right? So at the end, it just cancels it within three steps and gives you an opportunity to collect and download all your data as well, right? And in fact, I like this example from AppQs. You know, it's very nice. Before you go, take a moment to celebrate your AppQ story so far. You know, this is what you created. This is how many checklists you have. This is how many flows you have designed. This is very nice. This is kind of a really nice way to offboard somebody. And in fact, these kind of people who have decided to cancel, they don't cancel because they hate the service most of the time. They just don't need it, right? Maybe, or maybe they just don't have the money to pay for another service for a couple of months. It's perfectly normal, right? So we should be respectful on that as well. So this is what we do as well. You know, whenever you cancel a subscription on Smashing, right, your data will be wiped out in 7 days. You can restore your plan. You can export your orders, and whatever, your data belongs to you. And we would never share it with third parties. And perfectly fine if you want to leave. We can't believe you stuck with us for so long, right? So all of this just shows that you're a human and respectful, that you kind of understand what's going on there, right? So, and again, I mentioned it already, I don't think that notifications are horrible. If you want to follow a flight, right, you might want to get notification in your browser, but you can't display it, at any point when somebody just enters the site. You have to ask permission at the point when you're certain that somebody is going to give you a yes. I think that this is a very important thing to consider here as well, right? Or even maybe, when it comes to notifications, oops, sorry, I just jumped. When it comes to notifications or subscriptions, why don't we have a more granular way of approaching it, right? Brett actually had a really interesting idea where he said that I'd love it if way more monthly services offered a pause subscription instead of just cancel. Oh, that makes sense. The same goes for notifications, maybe. The same goes for other things. So kind of pausing subscription might be actually a really, really good idea, right? Well, I think I could go on forever here, but I think that I wanted to convey kind of a couple of clear and important considerations here of where we're heading and what is the state of things. So let me just jump to the bottom so I can maybe dive in later, and I'm sure that some of you might have questions as well. And so to wrap up, I wanted to share a couple of things that's really important to me, right? And don't get me wrong, I'm not the person who is crazy about privacy and tries to protect all the bits of information about me. But I wanted to understand why we ended up in the world in which we are. And I also wanted to understand how we, as designers who have incredible responsibility to make things around us, right? And developers, of course, as well, how we can make things a little bit better. Now, when I was in the US, I was in a very strange conversation, because all of a sudden I ended up talking to politicians or people from legislation, kind of asking me why designers and developers are so special, or why they think they're special. And I was confused because why I didn't even understand what they mean. But the idea was very simple, because if you think about doctors and lawyers and any proper professions, well, you'll find out that all of them have to go to school and study and get the license and then practice. Like, this is how it works. But everybody can wake up in the morning and say, hey, I'm a designer, right? And design things, right? The same goes for developers. Everybody can wake up in the morning, look in video tutorials on YouTube, learn a bit of JavaScript and React, and say, I'm a JavaScript developer, right? And so the idea that was kind of transmitted over to me was, why shouldn't designers and developers have licenses as well, just like regular people? And I don't think that this is a way forward. And if we don't understand what's happening in terms of privacy, and if we don't protect the web that we all love and are becoming a part of, that we're designing and building, right, then things will get a little bit worse for all of us. So I think it's really important for us to move the web toward that cleaner space where people really like the web again, right, where everything is not polluted all the time. And I honestly believe the GDPR, although the first implementation was really weird, and the things that kind of we see these cookie pop-ups all over, which is not the point. I think that in some way, this is the right direction to go through. It just takes up to us and the legislation to make things a little bit better over the next couple of years. And I'm sure that we'll get there, right? There are all these interfaces that are just not working for regular people, which is why they're using ad blockers, right? And so if we are paying attention and if we are designing with legislation in mind and building with legislation in mind, we might end up in a really, really nice place in a couple of years. And this is the internet I would like to be a part of, right? So this is my story. I hope that some of those things were useful for you. I will be sharing the slides and all with you as well. And I'm looking forward to your questions. Let's see if we have any questions. Oh, we do have a couple of questions. Okay, so I'm just going to dive right in. And I'm going to also stop sharing the screen. So let's see if you can actually see me better. And I'm going to open YouTube as well, because, I wasn't there. Let's see. So first of all, thank you so much for listening to all this. Maybe I ran a little bit over. I tend to do that sometimes. Right? So let me see if we have any questions on YouTube as well. A couple of people were replying to the email. All right, so let's go back to Zoom then. So Pawan is wondering, is there a duration for which the cookie selections are valid or stored? For example, how often can you show the cookie preference to users? Every visit, every week, month, etc. That's a good question. When it comes to interfaces, you have only one choice, really. It's not like you can actually ask anytime. I mean, of course, if somebody is accepting only core functionality, I'm not sure actually if you're allowed, or how would it work best. Can you show more options later? Unfortunately, I think I can answer it in proper way now. But obviously, whenever somebody is selecting something, then this setting is kind of defining what they want the experience to be. So I'm not even sure if you're allowed to ask. But that's not something I can actually answer right away. But I can actually check, that's for sure. And another question is, are sites or browsers permitted to offer incentives to allow tracking? Oh, that I don't know either. Again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm just trying to understand what's going on. I don't know. But when I think you're very good questions, that's something I would need to double check as well. Sorry for not being a bit more helpful. Do we have any more questions? Well, if not, that's fine too. One more message. No, okay, I think we're good so far. And thank you so much to Alexander for the notes. Well, I hope that some of those things were at least useful. Yeah. Is it legal to add someone to a mailing list after they have bought something? Well, only if they opted in, right? So you can't, I don't believe that you can add somebody to the mailing list without asking for the permission first. So, you can, I don't think you can add them to the mailing list, and I don't think you can send them anything without their consent, except maybe the confirmation about the email. So I think that in many ways, when you look into this privacy thing and GDPR, one important thing to understand is it's kind of trying to be user focused, right? So if the customer is likely to expect something, an email from you, then it's definitely perfectly fine. But if not, then you probably shouldn't be collecting that data and use the data in any way. And as Scott mentioned as well, keep in mind that we have another webinar coming up next week with Rachel Andrew when she's going to build a CSS layout live, right? So don't forget that one. With that in mind, if there are questions, feel free to ping me as well later. I just posted the slides in the Smashing membership dashboard, so feel free to use them there. There are way more slides than the ones that I covered today, but I thought that this could be kind of an interesting selection, so to say. And if you have more questions, feel free to ping me anytime. I'm not going anywhere, I guess. So with this in mind, thanks everyone, goodbye, and hopefully talk to you soon.